Story 1. The summer had finally passed, giving way to the crisp relief of autumn, then the suffocating silence of a long, northern winter. But for Alara, Sam, and Mia, the seasons were irrelevant. They lived in a perpetual, simmering August, haunted by the knowledge that their reprieve was temporary, and their defender was resting on the cold, dark floor of the lake. They had been unable to retrieve the brass bell. Twice, Sam, an accomplished free diver, tried to locate it in the deep water where the dock ended, but the lake floor was a featureless, silty black, and the water was unnaturally murky at that specific depth. After the second attempt, he came up shivering, not from the cold, but from the distinct feeling of being watched. Not with hunger, but with boundless, patient curiosity. They sold the cabin, not immediately, but slowly, pretending to move on. They drove 3 hours south, settled into a shared, generic rental house in a bland suburb, and tried to rebuild lives that were fundamentally hollowed out. Mia, the former perfectionist, was now a compulsive minimalist. She had quit her music program. She couldn't touch a piano without the ghost of her mother's approval filling the room, but the fear of imperfection was gone, replaced by a devastating acceptance of mediocrity. Her apartment was clinically clean, almost barren, but she never finished anything. She would start a painting, realize it wasn't perfect, and leave it mid-stroke, completely unconcerned by the flaw. The vulnerability had returned, but the drive to overcome it had not. She was emotionally sound, but inert. Sam, having regained his grief, was drowning in it. The casual dismissal of his father's death was replaced by a crippling, active guilt. He left his job and spent every waking hour restoring old, dilapidated wooden boats. He needed the friction, the physical struggle, the raw imperfection of chipped paint and corroded metal. He was desperate to make up for the lie the lake had shown him. But he was also terrified of being alone. Every night, he slept on the couch in the living room, listening to the white noise machine Alara had bought, afraid of a silence that might swallow his hard-won pain. Alara was the only one who seemed outwardly functional, but her internal world was a battlefield. The stolen compulsion had left a terrible emptiness. She still pursued her mythology degree, but the chase was muted. The excitement of discovery was gone. She understood the journal, she finished the translations, but the profound, passionate need to connect the dots was replaced by cold, clinical analysis. She had to force herself to read, to write, to think, a purely academic exercise, divorced from any joy. The scholarly fire had been replaced by duty, but the one thing that hadn't dulled was their certainty. The fetching hour was cyclical. It was tied to the lake, the high pressure, and the stagnant, unnatural heat that defined the hour of stillness. They had 1 year. They had to find a replacement for the brass bell. Alara's finished translation of her grandfather's final notebook offered only one obscure clue. The bell was of brass, the earth alloy of the ancients. It held the vibration of discord. If the bell is lost, only the pure refusal can stand against the perfect want. The refusal must be hammered, not cast. It must be a tool of honest denial. Discord and refusal, Alara said one rainy evening, spreading sketches and notes across their cheap dining table. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. It doesn't rust. It's physically discordant. Two elements forced together. The fetching hour is perfect stillness, perfect unity of desire. We need to create a physical object of absolute disharmony. Sam, his hands scarred from sanding old hulls, nodded grimly. A hammer. Something that denies the wood the way I deny the boat the truth it showed me. Or something that holds true denial, Mia said quietly, looking up from her empty sketchpad. She was finally drawing again, but only blank canvases. The thing I wanted most was approval, perfection. The ultimate denial is to reject that desire. To acknowledge, and then refuse, the deepest self. We need an artifact of self-repudiation. This led them to a terrifying idea. The brass bell had been an external tether, a tool. The next defense had to be personal. They spent weeks arguing, researching forgotten smithing techniques, and driving hundreds of miles to obscure antique shops. Finally, Alara settled on a plan centered around wrought iron. Wrought iron, she explained. It's pure iron, hammered into shape by hand. It's full of microscopic slag inclusions. It's fundamentally imperfect, full of visible, forced imperfections, impurities trapped inside the metal during the hammering process. It's the material opposite of a perfect, reflective surface. It is the physical manifestation of friction and entropy. They found a small, isolated blacksmith in the Upper Peninsula, a man who worked only with old techniques in a coal forge. Alara commissioned him to make a single, simple object, a trivet. A wrought iron trivet, heavy and crude, designed to hold heat and protect surfaces, a physical barrier between the living, the object of heat, and the dead, the surface underneath. They paid him in cash, refusing to give him a reason, only insisting that it must be hammered when the metal was cold, forcing the internal structure to resist its form. The process made the iron brittle, full of stress fractures, and profoundly discordant. The summer was now beginning its slow, inescapable climax. The temperature forecasts were grim. A week of unbroken, record-breaking 90-degree heat and humidity. The air pressure was rising, the weather patterns stalling. The signs started subtly. First, the crickets outside their suburban house began to fall silent, one by one. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow impossibly loud, then vanish, replaced by a ringing silence. Then came the dreams. They all dreamt of the lake, but not of the fetching hour itself. They dreamt of what the lake had taken. Alara dreamt of a massive library, but the books were all blank, their pages clean, white, and endless. She felt no horror, only a quiet, crushing resignation. It's enough, the silence whispered in the dust. Sam dreamt of his father, not sailing the perfect boat, but sitting in the unfinished, decaying hull, silent, staring at the water with disappointment. The grief was gone from the dream, leaving only the dull, flat weight of his own failure. Mia dreamt of her mother applauding, but the applause had no sound. It was just hands meeting flesh, a silent, meaningless gesture, over and over, until the emptiness of the noise filled her mind. They woke on the morning of August 25th, exactly 1 year and 1 day since the first stillness, to an atmosphere of thick, physical dread. The air conditioning in their rental had failed, just like the cabins had. The radio weather forecast was interrupted by a burst of static, followed by a low, almost inaudible thrumming sound. The sound of water under pressure. Tonight, Alara stated, looking at the clock, 1 a.m. We're too far from the lake for the fetching hour, but the stillness is spreading. It knows where we are. She retrieved the wrought iron trivet from the safe where they had kept it. It was heavy, rough, and cold to the touch, full of the forced impurities they had demanded. The artifact of refusal. The journal said the fetching is triggered when the night becomes a mirror of the day, Alara whispered. We need to break the reflection. We need to create the ultimate, self-inflicted imperfection. She looked at Sam, who was shaking, and Mia, who was gripping the edge of the table. Sam, you need to feel your guilt. Mia, you need to feel your vulnerability. And I need to force the question. We have to want the pain back, and then use this trivet to deny the reflection one last time. Mia spoke, her voice trembling but steady. I need to draw the perfect picture of what my mother wanted, and then rip it up. Sam nodded, his eyes fixed on the blank TV screen. I need to watch a video of the old boat, unfinished, broken, and acknowledge that I'll never fix it. That I failed him. Alara placed the wrought iron trivet in the center of the table. "And she said, feeling the emptiness of her own diminished curiosity, I need to burn the last pages of Grandpa's journal, the ones I haven't translated yet. The ultimate, unachievable truth. The final knowledge. I need to deliberately refuse to know the end." It was the ultimate act of self-repudiation, destroying the thing they wanted most, or accepting the painful reality they had denied. As 2:30 a.m. approached, the stillness returned. The electric clock on the stove froze at 2:35. The thrumming sound was closer now, not a lake, but a vast, wet sound of reflection growing in the air around them. The window of the suburban house, far from any natural body of water, began to shimmer faintly, showing not the boring street, but a deep, liquid blackness. The mirror had found them again. They had built the tool of refusal, but the payment for breaking the mirror would be the permanent loss of their most vital parts. The fetching hour had come for the second, and perhaps final, time. Story 2. The Loneliness of St. Jude's Point Lighthouse wasn't quiet. It was a deep, pervasive ticking. It wasn't the sound of the main clock mechanism, which hammered out the hours with ponderous, metallic certainty. This was a smaller, more intimate sound, a constant, dry tick-tick-tick that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the tower, like a hidden insect perpetually winding a forgotten spring. Alistair Kalin, the latest in a long line of temporary occupants, was a historian, not a keeper. He had been contracted to spend 3 months archiving the century and a half of logbooks, duty rosters, and maintenance reports before the lighthouse was fully automated. His task was to preserve the past. His fear was becoming obsolete, interchangeable. The building reflected his fear back at him. It was a masterpiece of Victorian routine, a spiral of cold, granite uniformity. The keeper's cottage was functional and sparse, the furniture worn smooth by generations of men who lived lives measured by the quarter hour. Alistair was meticulous. He had to be. His job demanded perfect duplication, transcribing brittle cursive into digital script, documenting every chipped tile and oil stain. He lived by the clock, rising at 6 a.m., logging from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., and eating a precisely measured dinner at 6:30 p.m. He liked the order. It was the only thing standing between him and the roaring chaos of the North Atlantic. The trouble began with the logs of Keeper Elias Thorne, dating back to 1898. Thorne was like Alistair, a man obsessed with detail. His script was flawless, his entries repetitive. 7 a.m., lamp lit. 8 a.m., lens cleaned. 10 a.m., fog. Horn sounding at interval. But deep within the 1899 logbook, Alistair found a secret pocket, the binding hollowed out with surgical precision. Inside was a tightly folded, unmarked piece of parchment. It was Thorne's true, private journal. June 12, 1899. The ticking has grown louder. It is not the watch, it is the winder. It does not measure time, it measures consistency. I believe the tower is not merely a structure for guiding ships, but a mechanism for achieving perfect, repeatable routine. The mechanism is starving. It wants a keeper who is flawlessly interchangeable. Alistair dismissed it as madness, the ravings of a solitary man. But the entry rattled him. He started paying closer attention to his own habits. He had a stack of blank index cards he used for cross-referencing names. He wrote the name of a missing keeper, Robert Vance, 1932, on the top card in his own handwriting, unique for its slight leftward slant on the V. He left the stack by the keyboard and went to the top level to inspect the lens. The lens chamber was frigid and vast, dominated by the massive, intricate Fresnel lens. It spun in slow, perfect rotations, reflecting the cold, gray afternoon light into sharp, mirrored shards. As Alistair watched, he saw a fleeting shadow, a man's silhouette, on the inner curve of the lens. It was his exact height and shape, but it was impossibly thin, stretched and compressed by the glass, moving with a jerky, clockwork precision. When Alistair moved his head, the shadow moved a moment too late, as if correcting its trajectory. He left the lens chamber quickly, his heart hammering. Back in the cottage, he returned to his desk. The stack of index cards was exactly where he left it. But the top card, the one marked Robert Vance, 1932, was subtly different. The handwriting was identical to his own, but the slight leftward slant on the V was gone. It was replaced by a perfect, vertical stroke. The entry was technically better than his own, more precise, more aligned with the baseline. Alistair grabbed the card, holding it to the light. He hadn't changed it. He knew his own flaws. This new V was flawless, perfectly regular. It was his hand, but not his flaw. He wrote a second card, identical to the first, consciously exaggerating the slant. He placed it beneath the first and stared at it, waiting for the correction. Nothing happened. He worked for an hour, the sound of the dry tick-tick-tick filling the silent room. When he looked back, the second card was also changed. The exaggerated slant was gone, replaced by the same unnervingly perfect, vertical V. The winder wasn't moving his things, it was refining them. It was sampling his routine, analyzing his minor imperfections, and replacing them with a more perfect archive of his action. Paranoia became his reality. He began deliberately disrupting his routines. He stirred his coffee counterclockwise. He left his shoes pointed in opposite directions. He intentionally misspelled a common name in the logbook, Johnson, instead of Johnson. The next morning, the shoes were perfectly aligned, heels pressed together. The coffee mug was back in the cupboard, and the logbook was open to the previous day's entry. The name, Johnson, was still there, but a tiny, faint dot of ink had appeared above the O, turning it into a silent, perfect umlaut, a character that didn't exist in the English maritime records, but made the word visually symmetrical. The error had been corrected, not by erasure, but by geometric optimization. That night, the fog rolled in. The sound was immense. The foghorn was not a mournful blast. It was a colossal, pneumatic roar that compressed the air in the small cottage, rattling the panes of glass. And with the foghorn came the absolute amplification of the ticking. It was no longer a dry whisper, it was a rhythmic, frantic winding. Alistair knew he had to find the source. Keeper Thorne's journal described a sub-level, a maintenance access beneath the main clockwork. Following the sound, Alistair found a narrow, corroded iron door hidden behind a stack of coal scuttles. He forced the latch and stepped down into the damp, dark space. It was not a basement. It was a vast, hemispherical chamber carved directly into the bedrock, dominated by a single, terrifying machine. The winding mechanism was a tower of brass and iron, 20 feet high, a colossal, beautiful, terrifying antique. It wasn't a clock, but a preservation engine. Thousands of tiny, reflective gears spun constantly, catching the weak beam of Alistair's flashlight and throwing back blinding, mirrored reflections. The air here was vibrating, thick with the smell of ozone and hot oil. This was the source of the frantic tick-tick-tick. The machine was powered by the foghorn. Every time the horn blasted, a huge piston drove down, turning the primary gear a single, agonizing degree, winding a central spring. The mechanism was driven by the very sound of navigational necessity. And in the very center of the mechanism, suspended within a spinning, reflective brass cylinder, was a man. He was not a skeleton, or a ghost, but a perfectly rendered image, a blurred, translucent phantom trapped in the brass. He wore the uniform of a keeper from the turn of the century. It was Elias Thorne. Thorn was screaming, his face contorted in agony and terror, but the sound of the foghorn outside was so loud and the ticking of the mechanism so fast that no sound escaped the chamber. He was preserved in a perpetual, silent, perfect moment of fear. The mechanism ceased its frantic winding for a moment. The entire chamber went still. The silence was heavier than the fog outside, a vacuum pressing on Alistair's mind. "Welcome," a voice stated, not in his ears, but directly in the empty space between his thoughts. The voice was calm, metallic, and possessed the chilling clarity of a librarian correcting a misplaced decimal. "You have found the core. Your routine has been measured. Your imperfections are minor. You are ready." Alistair scrambled backward, hitting the wet stone wall. "What do you want?" he croaked, the sound swallowed by the thick air. "I want perfection. I want the perfect keeper, untroubled by personal whim, unfettered by unique flaw." Elias Thorne began to fear the silence. He broke routine. He began to introduce chaos. He was flawed. "I took the perfected, archived version of his life, his logbooks, his meticulous habits, and I preserved them. His imperfection is contained here." The mechanism vibrated, pointing a brass rod toward Thorne's trapped reflection. "Now, I have archived you. The perfect Alistair Kalin exists. Precise, meticulous, interchangeable. He is better at being you than you are." Alistair looked at the spinning reflections, seeing the vague outline of his own silhouette in the brass. The perfect version of himself, the one who never misspelled a word, never doubted his own purpose, was ready to take over. He would be preserved, eternally frozen, an archive of perfection, while the real Alistair would be replaced. He thought of the perfect V on the index card. He thought of the flawless umlaut. He thought of his own soul, messy and anxious, defined by the desperate, imperfect need to understand the past. That messy, anxious self was what the mechanism was trying to purge. "Submit, Alistair. Your replacement is ready. His documentation is flawless. You will be preserved, complete, archived, eternal." The foghorn began its slow, agonizing wind-up for the next blast. The brass piston started to rise, preparing to fuel the mechanism. Alistair had seconds. He needed discord. He needed the ultimate, unforgivable, irreversible imperfection. He looked around the chamber. The only thing that was truly him, the only thing that contained his unique, flawed perspective, was the archive he was creating. He pulled the water-stained logbook of Elias Thorne from his satchel, the one containing the secret, perfect entry about the winder. He flipped past Thorne's perfect script to the blank pages where he had started his own transcription. Alistair grabbed a sharp slate shard from the floor and, in the dim, frantic light of the mechanism, began to deface his work. He dragged the stone across the pristine pages, not erasing, but tearing the paper, driving the shard through the ink, ripping the perfect, transcribed sentences into chaotic, unrecognizable shreds. He smeared the ink with oil from the machine, creating an ugly, wet, chaotic mess that was the very antithesis of documentation. He wasn't destroying the work, he was destroying the perfection of the transcription. He was introducing unrecoverable, unarchivable chaos. The moment the slate tore the final page in half, the mechanism gave a soundless shriek. The spinning gears violently locked. The reflections shattered. The brass rod pointing at him recoiled, bending with a sound like grinding teeth. Imperfection. Chaos. You have ruined the archive. The foghorn outside roared, but this time, the blast was cut short, a choked, fractured sound that ended in a sickening wheeze. The mechanism had absorbed the energy, but the intentional, internal sabotage of its perfect dataset had caused a catastrophic spiritual short-circuit. The mechanism shuddered, then fell silent. The incessant tick-tick-tick was gone. Alistair stood, gasping, staring at the motionless brass tower. Elias Thorne's reflection was still there, but it was fading, becoming just a faint, hazy outline in the metal. He fled the chamber, latching the door behind him and securing it with a rusty chain. He made it back to the cottage just as the sun rose, piercing the lingering remnants of the fog. He looked at his desk. The index card with the perfectly vertical V was still there. The logbook on the desk was undisturbed, pristine. But in his satchel, the ruined pages of Thorne's book, the pages he had deliberately destroyed, remained torn, smeared, and ruined. The chaos was real. He had saved his flawed self by sacrificing the order he craved. The lighthouse was silent now, truly silent, save for the sound of the ocean waves and the returning cries of the gulls. Alistair looked at the perfect index card. He picked up his pen, a cheap blue plastic stick, and wrote a new entry on a blank card, this time not a transcription, but a simple question: "Am I still Alistair?" He signed it, deliberately letting his T run into his A sloppy, ugly, imperfect mark. He watched the card, willing the correction to appear. But the silence remained unbroken. The mechanism was quiet. He had won, but at the price of his own meticulousness. He was still Alistair, the man who craved order. But now, he lived with the knowledge that his flaws were the only things keeping him real, and the perfect, cold silence of St. Jude's Point was merely waiting for him to slip back into routine. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.